Yo, what's up, fam? Buckle up, because this story is going to hit different. We're diving into the wildlife of Jake Harland, 43 years old, living way out in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, 37 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless pine and silence. Out here, there's no phone signal, no neighbors, just the wind and the wild. Jake wasn't just hiding from the law. He was running an old-school moonshine operation, cooking liquor in the woods like it was still the Prohibition era. But one cold night, something came out of those trees, something big, heavy, and breathing like a storm. People out there still swear it wasn't human. Before we jump in, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and whether you believe in Bigfoot or not. Because after this story, you just might. Jake wasn't always a moonshiner hiding in the mountains. Used to have a regular wife, kids, a decent construction job in Casper. But life has a way of falling apart when you least expect it. Divorce hit him hard, took everything he had including his relationship with his kids, who stopped returning his calls. Man spiraled for a while, drinking heavy, bouncing between jobs, until he realized he was better at making liquor than drinking it. So 8 years ago, he packed up what little he had left and disappeared into the Wind River Range with a copper still and a dream that probably should have stayed a dream. But Jake found his groove out there, built himself a whole setup in this perfect hidden spot. Natural spring water, dense pine cover, caves that masked the smoke from his operation. The wilderness was brutal as hell, don't get it twisted. Grizzlies, mountain lions, winters that dropped to 40 below where you could literally die in your sleep if your fire went out. But Jake was stubborn. Always had been. That same stubborn streak that ruined his marriage kept him alive out here. His typical day started before sunrise. Check the still, adjust the temperature, monitor the mash fermenting in wooden barrels. The whole process took time, and attention couldn't rush quality shine. Head chop wood, maintain his equipment, make supply runs to town every couple weeks to sell his product, and stock up on basics. Simple life, lonely as hell, but it was his. No boss, no ex-wife's lawyer, no disappointed looks from his kids. Just him, the mountains, and the sweet smell of corn liquor cooking. The weird shit started in September 2019. Jake had left a batch fermenting while he made a supply run standard 5-day trip to sell his product and restock. When he came back, something felt off. Can't even explain it properly, you know. Like when you walk into your crib and just know somebody was there, even though nothing's moved. Everything was exactly where he left it, but the vibe was different. The air felt disturbed. Then he saw the footprints around his fire pit. Now, Jake knew bear tracks. Had seen plenty living out here. These weren't bears. These were something else, entirely humanoid but massive, 18 inches long, 5 toes just like a human foot but 3 times the damn size. The stride length was impossible for any person, nearly 6 feet between steps. Whatever made these tracks had walked straight through his camp, stopped at the still like it was window shopping, then continued into the forest. What the hell? Jake muttered, kneeling down to examine the prints closer. They were pressed deep into the Wyoming mud, deeper than his own boots, even when he was carrying heavy equipment. The thing that made these had to weigh at least 600 pounds, maybe more. Smart move we'd been packing up right then. Dismantling the whole operation, finding a new location far away from whatever the hell left those tracks. But Jake had 12 gallons of premium shine ready to bottle, and buyers waiting, the kind of buyers who don't appreciate delays and might decide to stop being buyers if you flaked on them. So he stayed, loaded his rifle, and tried to convince himself it was some kind of hoax, maybe another moonshiner trying to scare him off his territory. That night, Jake heard the wood knocks. 3 deliberate strikes against a tree, maybe 200 yards from camp. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder, shaking snow from branches. Head heard all the normal forest sounds living out here. Woodpeckers, branches falling, elk bugling during rut. This was different. This had intent behind it, like someone sending a message in code he couldn't understand. Jake didn't sleep that night, just sat there with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line like his life depended on it, which, for all he knew, it did. Around 3 in the morning, he saw eyes shine at the edge of his firelight, too high off the ground to be a wolf, too steady to be an owl. Whatever it was stood there for 20 minutes, just watching him. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness, without making a single sound. The next morning, Jake found where it had been standing. More tracks, and the ground was compressed like something heavy had been shifting its weight back and forth. But what really got his attention were the broken branches, 9 feet up, where the thing had been holding onto the trees for support. 9 feet tall. What in creation stands 9 feet tall and walks on 2 legs? Bigfoot, Jake said out loud, then immediately felt stupid. I'm losing my damn mind out here. But the evidence was right there in front of him. Either Sasquatch was real and living in his backyard, or someone was going to elaborate lengths to make him think so. Neither option was particularly comforting. Jake had a decision to make: pack up and lose everything he'd built, or stay and risk another encounter with whatever the hell was out there. The smart money was on leaving, but Jake wasn't smart. He was stubborn. This was his territory, his operation. He'd dealt with claim jumpers, federal raids, and every predator the Rockies could throw at him. He wasn't about to let some overgrown ape run him off, real or not. So Jake adapted. Started leaving food scraps at the edge of camp, nothing fancy, just leftovers from his meals. Beans, cornbread, dried meat. Every morning, the food was gone. No mess. No scattered remains, like you'd see with bears who tear through everything like slobs. Just gone, clean as can be, with those massive tracks leading away into the forest. After 2 weeks of this routine, something extraordinary happened. Jake was tending the still one evening, adjusting the temperature on the condenser, completely focused on his work. That's when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Each step shook the ground just slightly. His rifle was leaning against a tree 20 feet away. Might as well have been 20 miles for all the good it would do him. Jake turned around real slow, hands visible, trying not to make any sudden movements that might trigger a predatory response. And there it was. 9 feet of muscle and dark brown hair, standing at the edge of his camp like it belonged there. Like it had been there all along, and Jake was the intruder. The face was almost human, but not quite broader, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight with an amber glow. The smell hit him hard, like wet dog mixed with something earthier, more primal. Musk and pine and earth all mixed together in a way that made his hindbrain scream danger while his conscious mind tried to stay calm. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Jake could see intelligence in those eyes, real thought happening behind them. This wasn't some animal operating on pure instinct. This thing was thinking, evaluating, deciding whether Jake was a threat or something else. Then Jake did something that surprised both of them. He spoke. "Easy there, big fellow. I'm not looking for trouble." The creature tilted its head, processing the sounds. Its nostrils flared, probably taking in Jake's scent, categorizing him as threat or not threat. Then it did something that changed everything. It sat down. Just plopped down on its haunches like a person settling in for a conversation, though it still towered over Jake even sitting. Jake kept talking. Nonsense mostly told the thing about the still, about the weather, about anything that came to mind. His voice seemed to calm it, or maybe it was just amusing itself with the strange little human making noise. Either way, it stayed for an hour just listening, occasionally tilting its head when Jake changed topics. When it finally stood to leave, it paused at the pile of scraps Jake had left out. Instead of taking them immediately, it looked back at Jake, then at the food, then back at Jake again like it was asking permission. Jake nodded, and the creature gathered up the scraps with surprisingly delicate movements before disappearing into the darkness. "Well, shit," Jake said to nobody. "I just made friends with Bigfoot." That became their routine over the next few weeks. Every few nights, the creature would appear at the edge of camp. Jake would talk, it would listen, then it would take the food and leave. Jake started calling it Moses. Don't ask him why. The name just felt right for something that appeared and disappeared like a biblical mystery. After a month, Moses started getting bolder. He'd come closer to the fire, sometimes sitting just 10 feet away. Jake could see the details then. The hair wasn't uniform like a bear's. It was longer on the arms and shoulders, shorter on the face and chest. The hands were massive, but perfectly proportioned with opposable thumbs and fingernails, not claws. The feet were exactly what made those tracks wide and flat, with an arch that suggested bipedal evolution going back, who knows how long. The intelligence in those eyes was what really got Jake. This wasn't some animal operating on instinct. Moses was thinking, evaluating, learning. He started recognizing patterns in Jake's routine. On bottling days, he'd show up just as Jake finished, knowing the human would be tired and stationary. On mash days, he'd keep his distance, understanding the process required Jake's full attention. Then came the night that proved just how smart Moses really was. Jake was dead asleep, when something woke him, not a sound exactly, more like a presence. He opened his eyes to find Moses standing over him, one massive hand held up in what looked like a stopping gesture. Before Jake could react, Moses pointed toward the trail leading down from the ridge. That's when Jake heard them. Voices still distant, but getting closer. Federal agents had to be. Nobody else would be hiking these trails at 2 in the morning. Moses looked at Jake, then at the still, then back at Jake. The meaning was clear. He understood what would happen if they found the operation. Jake jumped up and started breaking down the critical parts of the still, the condenser, the copper coil, anything that would immediately identify it as moonshine equipment. Moses watched for a moment, then did something that still gives Jake chills thinking about it. He started helping, picked up 2 50-pound bags of corn mash like they were pillows and carried them into the cave. Then he came back for the fermenting barrels, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. They worked in complete silence, Moses following Jake's lead, anticipating what needed to be moved next. In 15 minutes, they'd hidden every trace of the operation. Then Moses did something even more remarkable. He walked to the trail the agents would be coming from and started breaking branches, disturbing the ground, creating false paths that led away from Jake's camp. He was laying down decoy trails, understanding not just that Jake needed to hide, but how human trackers work. Jake grabbed his camping gear and made the site look like a regular backpacker's camp. Moses vanished into the forest, but Jake could feel him watching. 20 minutes later, 3 ATF agents walked into camp, flashlights blazing, hands on their weapons. Federal agents, one announced like Jake, couldn't see the giant letters on his jacket, were investigating reports of illegal distillery operations in this area. Jake played the confused hiker, rubbing his eyes and asking what this was about. They searched the camp, found nothing but standard camping equipment and some beef jerky. One of them noticed the tracks Moses had left earlier, and his whole demeanor changed. "You seen any bears around here?" he asked, though his voice suggested he knew those weren't bear tracks. "No, sir," Jake replied. "But something big came through yesterday. Didn't get a good look at it." They exchanged glances, and Jake saw something in their faces. He didn't expect fear. These weren't local boys. They didn't know these mountains, but they knew enough to recognize that those tracks belonged to something they didn't want to meet in the dark. They left within the hour, making excuses about covering more ground before dawn. As their voices faded down the trail, Moses emerged from the forest. He walked straight to the cave and started bringing Jake's equipment back out, not randomly, but placing everything exactly where it had been before. He'd memorized the entire layout of the operation. That's when Jake realized this wasn't just some primitive creature living in the woods. Moses had complex reasoning abilities. He understood law enforcement, concealment, misdirection. He'd protected Jake's operation, not because he cared about moonshine, but because Head recognized the mutual benefit of their arrangement. Jake provided food, Moses provided security. The partnership evolved from there. Moses started bringing Jake things firewood at first, perfect pieces already dried and cut to length. Jake would wake up to find a neat stack beside his fire pit, those massive tracks, the only sign of his visit. Then Moses started bringing pine cones and kindling, somehow understanding that Jake needed different materials for different types of fires. Jake increased the food offerings in return, started cooking extra portions specifically for Moses. Found out the big guy loved cornbread with honey, would practically purr when eating it. That's right, he purred, a deep rumbling sound from his chest that was nothing like any vocalization Jake had heard from known animals. Winter was approaching, and Jake was worried about Moses. The snows in Wyoming can be brutal, and he didn't know if Moses had adequate shelter. One evening, Jake tried to communicate this, pointed at the sky, made shivering gestures, pointed at the caves. Moses seemed to understand, but shook his head. Then he stood and gestured for Jake to follow him. Jake grabbed his rifle and flashlight, though Moses moved through the darkness like he had built-in night vision. They hiked for about a mile up steep terrain Jake would have struggled with in daylight. Moses would pause occasionally, looking back to make sure Jake was keeping up, sometimes reaching out to steady him on particularly treacherous sections. He led Jake to a cave system hidden behind a fall of rocks that looked natural but had definitely been arranged. Inside, the cave was warm, not just warmer than outside, but genuinely warm. Moses had found a geothermal vent and built his shelter around it. The cave was organized, areas for sleeping, eating, and what looked like tool storage. Yes, tool stones that had been shaped for specific purposes, sticks fashioned into digging implements. Moses wasn't just intelligent. He was a tool user, a creator, a being with culture and practical knowledge. He showed Jake around like a proud homeowner, demonstrating how he diverted water from an underground stream into a natural basin, how he'd arranged rocks to maximize the heat from the thermal vent. There were bones in one corner, picked clean and sorted by size. Some were from deer and elk, but others were from bears. Moses was an apex predator who could take down a grizzly. But what struck Jake most were the walls. They were covered in markings, not quite writing, but intentional patterns scraped into the rock. Some seemed representational, showing trees, mountains, animals. Others were more abstract, possibly counting systems or calendars. Moses had been documenting his world. He led Jake to one section and pointed at a marking, then at Jake, then at the marking again. It was a crude but recognizable representation of Jake's still. Moses had drawn the operation into his history. Jake was part of his story now, just as Moses had become part of Jake's. The walk back to camp was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. They'd crossed some invisible line from tolerance to trust. Moses didn't just accept Jake's presence in his territory, had welcomed him into his world. As winter set in, their routine adjusted. Moses visited less frequently, probably conserving energy during the cold months. But when he did come, he'd stay longer, sometimes sitting by Jake's fire for hours. Jake would talk about anything and everything, told Moses about his ex-wife, about his kids who didn't speak to him anymore, about how they'd ended up running shine in the mountains. Moses would listen with intense focus, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed like responses, not words, but emotional reactions. Sympathy when Jake talked about loss, amusement when he told funny stories, concern when he mentioned dangers. Moses understood tone, context, emotional subtext. This wasn't just an animal responding to sound patterns. This was genuine comprehension. One particularly cold night in January, the temperature dropped to -30. Jake's little camp stove couldn't keep up, and he was burning through firewood faster than usual. He was genuinely worried about freezing to death. Then Moses appeared with an armload of wood that would have required 3 trips for Jake. But it wasn't just any wood he'd brought: fatwood, pine saturated with resin that burns hot and long. He knew exactly what Jake needed. Moses stacked the wood and then did something unprecedented. He sat down right next to Jake, his massive bulk blocking the wind. The heat radiating from his body was like sitting next to a furnace. They sat like that all night. Moses sheltering Jake from the killing cold, Jake feeding the fire that seemed to comfort them both. In the morning, when the temperature had risen to merely brutal instead of lethal, Moses stood to leave. But before he did, he placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. The weight of it was staggering, but the touch was gentle. It was acknowledgement, gratitude maybe, or just connection. Then he was gone, leaving only tracks and the memory of warmth. February brought new challenges. A rival moonshiner named Curtis Hobbs had been sniffing around the area, trying to locate Jake Still. Had been undercutting Jake's prices in town, claiming he had a superior product and that Jake's operation was about to be shut down. Jake knew Hobbs was looking for his site, planning to either steal his equipment or rat him out to the feds. Jake told Moses about Hobbs during one of his visits, described what he looked like, what his truck sounded like, the danger he represented. Moses listened with unusual intensity, his eyes narrowing when Jake explained how Hobbs had threatened other moonshiners in the past, sometimes violently. 3 days later, Hobbs showed up at Jake's camp while he was in the middle of a run. Couldn't shut down the still without ruining the batch. Couldn't defend himself without abandoning expensive equipment. Hobbs had timed it perfectly, probably been watching for days. Well, Hobbs said, stepping into the clearing with a shotgun cradled in his arms. The famous Jake Harland. Nice setup you got here. Jake kept working, trying to stay calm. This is private property, Curtis. You're trespassing. Hobbs laughed, an ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. Ain't nobody's property out here, friend. Just wilderness and opportunity. I'm thinking you're going to have an accident. Stills blow up all the time. Real tragedy when it happens. He was moving closer, the shotgun now pointed vaguely in Jake's direction. That's when they heard it, a roar that shook snow from the trees. Not like a bear or a mountain lion. Deeper, more primal, with an undertone of rage that made every hair on Jake's body stand up. Hobbs spun around, shotgun raised, just as Moses emerged from the forest. But this wasn't the gentle giant who shared Jake's fire. This was a territorial predator defending its domain. Moses stood at full height, arms spread wide, displaying his massive frame. The roar came again, and Jake saw Hobbs' hands shaking. "What the hell is that?" Hobbs whispered, taking a step back. Moses advanced slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on the intruder. Hobbs raised the shotgun, and Jake thought for sure he was going to fire. But Moses was smart. He grabbed a pine tree as thick as Jake's thigh and twisted. The crack of wood breaking was like a gunshot. The tree, 30 feet tall, came down between Moses and Hobbs, who dove backward to avoid being crushed. When Hobbs scrambled to his feet, Moses was standing on the fallen tree, now eye level with the terrified moonshiner despite being 20 feet away. The message was clear: leave, or become part of the forest floor. Hobbs ran, dropped his shotgun, and ran like the devil was chasing him. They heard his truck engine start 10 minutes later, tires spinning in the snow as he fled. He never came back. Word got around that Jake's operation was protected by something unnatural, and the other shiners gave him a wide berth after that. Moses stayed visible until they were sure Hobbs was gone, then approached Jake slowly, his posture shifting from aggressive to concerned. He examined Jake carefully, checking for injuries, sniffing for the scent of fear or harm. When he was satisfied Jake was okay, he did something that broke Jake's heart a little. He hugged him. It wasn't a human hug exactly, more like an enveloping where Moses wrapped his long arms around Jake and pulled him against his chest. Jake could hear his heartbeat, faster than expected, probably from the adrenaline of confrontation. They stood like that for maybe 10 seconds before Moses released him and stepped back. Jake tried to thank him, but how do you thank someone for saving your life without using words they can't understand? He just nodded and put his hand on Moses' arm. The hair was coarser than expected, but the skin underneath was warm and surprisingly soft. Moses placed his massive hand over Jake's, engulfing it completely, and they stood there in silent understanding. Spring came late that year, but when it did, Moses changed his behavior again. He started bringing Jake things from the forest, not just firewood, but gifts. Interesting rocks, antler sheds, once a perfect eagle feather that must have taken him hours to find. He'd present each item formally, waiting for Jake's reaction before placing it carefully near his tent. Jake reciprocated with food, of course, but also started leaving other things for Moses. A steel knife to replace his stone tools, a tarp for his cave, a pair of work gloves that were comically small for his hands but which he seemed to treasure. Moses would examine each gift thoroughly, turning it over in his hands, testing its properties, learning its purpose. The gloves fascinated Moses particularly. He understood their function immediately but was intrigued by the stitching, running his fingers along the seams repeatedly. Within a week, Jake found a piece of deer hide near his camp that Moses had attempted to sew with plant fibers, creating a crude but functional pouch. Moses wasn't just using tools, he was reverse engineering them, learning manufacturing techniques from observation. In May, Jake had to make an extended supply run to town. Usually he was gone for 2 days maximum, but this time he needed to meet with distributors in Denver, meaning he'd be away for at least a week. Jake tried to explain this to Moses, using a combination of gestures and props. 7 rocks for 7 days, pointing at the trail, then at himself, then walking his fingers away and back. Moses seemed agitated by this news, pacing back and forth, making low grumbling sounds. Jake thought he was worried either for Jake's safety or about the disruption to their routine. He left extra food, enough for 2 weeks, and tried to reassure Moses he'd return. The trip took 9 days. Truck broke down outside Laramie, had to wait for parts. The whole time Jake worried about Moses. Had he thought Jake abandoned him? Would he still trust him when he returned? When Jake finally made it back to camp, the place was immaculate. The still had been cleaned, the copper polished to a shine. Firewood was stacked, military neat. The ground around his tent had been cleared of debris. Moses had been taking care of Jake's space in his absence. Moses appeared that first night back, but his approach was different, hesitant, almost shy. He sat farther away than usual, watching Jake with what could only be described as hurt feelings. Jake talked more that night than he had in months, explaining about the truck, the delay, showing Moses the new supplies he'd brought. Gradually, Moses moved closer until by midnight, they were back to their usual positions by the fire. Jake had brought Moses something special from town, a chocolate bar, the good stuff with almonds. When Jake handed it to him, Moses' eyes went wide. He sniffed it carefully, then took the smallest possible bite. The expression on his face was pure joy. He savored that chocolate bar for an hour, making it last, closing his eyes with each piece like he was memorizing the experience. That's when Jake realized how lonely Moses' existence must be. Moses was the only one of his kind Jake had ever seen sign of no tracks but his, no other vocalizations in response to his calls. He was alone in these mountains, maybe alone in the world. Their friendship wasn't just convenience or mutual benefit, it was companionship for both of them. 2 outsiders who had found understanding in the most unlikely place. Summer brought its own challenges, more hikers in the wilderness, increased federal patrols, and the constant worry of forest fires. Moses adapted to all of it with remarkable intelligence. He started ranging farther during his patrols, often bringing Jake news of approaching humans long before they could stumble upon his operation. Moses' warning system was sophisticated, different knocks for different threats. 2 knocks meant hikers in the area but not approaching. 3 meant law enforcement. 1 long scraping sound meant immediate danger. He'd even developed a way to indicate direction and distance, using combinations of sounds that Jake learned to interpret like Morse code. One afternoon in July, Jake heard the scraping sound, followed by rapid knocks. He barely had time to cover the still before a Forest Service helicopter flew directly overhead. They were doing aerial surveillance, looking for illegal operations exactly like Jake's. Without Moses' warning, They would have caught him red-handed. The helicopter circled twice, but saw nothing suspicious, just a camper with a tarp over his gear, completely normal for backcountry Wyoming. When it finally flew away, Moses emerged from the trees. He'd been watching the helicopter with intense focus, and Jake could see him processing this new information. Threats could come from above now, not just from the ground. Within days, Moses had adjusted their security accordingly. He started checking the sky regularly, learned the sound of distant helicopters, even figured out their patrol patterns. Moses understood scheduling, recognized that the flights came at regular intervals, and adjusted his visits to avoid them. But the most impressive display of Moses' intelligence came during the Bennett fire that August. Lightning strikes started ablaze about 10 miles north of Jake's position. Wind was pushing it south, straight toward his camp. Jake was preparing to evacuate, trying to figure out how to move or hide the still, when Moses appeared in full daylight, something he never did. He was agitated, gesturing frantically toward the east. Not south where the fire was coming from, but east into terrain Jake had never explored. Jake tried to explain that he needed to go west, toward the road, toward civilization. But Moses was insistent, actually grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him eastward. Jake had to make a choice, trust his own instincts and flee toward town, or follow Moses into unknown wilderness with a forest fire bearing down on them. The desperation in Moses' eyes made the decision. Jake grabbed his essential gear and followed. Moses led him through a maze of canyons and ridges Jake never knew existed. The route was treacherous but specific. Moses knew exactly where he was going. After 2 hours of hard hiking, Jake understood why. Moses had led him to a massive granite formation with a deep overhang, surrounded by a natural firebreak of bare rock. They sheltered there as the fire passed, the smoke thick, but the flames unable to reach their position. Moses had known about this safe zone, had calculated wind direction and fire speed, had understood that west led to roads that would be clogged with evacuees and emergency vehicles. Had saved Jake's life with planning and foresight that most humans couldn't have managed. They stayed in that shelter for 2 days while the fire burned itself out. Moses foraged for both of them, bringing water from a spring he knew about, finding edible plants Jake would never have recognized. When it was finally safe to return, Jake's camp was untouched. The fire had passed just a quarter-mile to the north, stopped by a creek, and shift in wind direction that Moses had somehow anticipated. The trust between them after that was absolute. Moses had risked exposure to save Jake, had shared survival knowledge that was clearly sacred to his existence. They were bonded now in a way that transcended species. Fall arrived with its usual glory in the Rockies' aspen gold, crisp air, and the constant bugle of elk in rut. Moses' behavior shifted with the season. He became more active, ranging farther, staying out longer. Jake wondered if this was mating season for his kind, if somewhere out there another of his species was responding to ancient biological imperatives. But Moses always returned, usually with gifts from his travels. Once he brought Jake an obsidian arrowhead, perfectly crafted and obviously ancient. Another time it was a chunk of turquoise the size of Jake's fist. Jake started teaching Moses things in return, simple stuff at first. How to tie knots, how to sharpen the knife Jake had given him, how to read basic weather signs. Moses absorbed information like a sponge. Within days of showing him a bowline knot, he was creating complex hitches and lashings Jake had never seen before. The knife became Moses' prized possession. He fashioned a sheath from elk hide, wore it on a cord around his neck. October brought the first serious snow and something else. Government scientists conducting some kind of environmental study. They set up a base camp about 3 miles from Jake's position, with equipment he couldn't identify and purposes he could only guess at. Moses spotted them first, and his agitation was unlike anything Jake had seen before. These weren't just threats to Jake's operation. They were threats to Moses. The scientists had trail cameras, motion sensors, equipment that could detect and document his existence. Moses understood this instinctively, recognized technology that could end his secretive life. They developed a plan together. Jake would create distractions, lead the scientists away from areas where Moses traveled. In return, Moses would help protect the still with even greater vigilance. It was risky for both of them, but necessary. The first part worked perfectly. Jake would show up at their camp occasionally, playing the friendly local, offering moonshine and conversation. They were geology graduates mostly, happy for the company, and completely unaware of his real purpose. Jake learned their survey patterns, their equipment limitations, where they'd placed their sensors. Moses, meanwhile, became a ghost. He learned the positions of every camera, the range of every sensor. Head moved through their grid like smoke, never triggering a single device. When he absolutely had to pass through monitored areas, Head used deer and elk as cover, moving in their shadows, letting their heat signatures mask his own. But technology wasn't their only problem. One of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, was sharper than the others. Shed found tracks, analyzed hair samples, noticed patterns in the wildlife behavior that suggested an apex predator the databases couldn't identify. She started asking questions, pushing boundaries, getting closer to the truth. One evening, she followed Jake back toward his camp. Not obviously, but Jake had learned to spot surveillance from Moses. She was good, professional even, but Moses was better. He led her on a wild chase, without her ever knowing she was being redirected. Every time she'd get close to something significant, a convenient noise or movement would draw her attention elsewhere. After 3 hours of this, Dr. Chen gave up, but not before making a comment that chilled Jake. "There's something out here," she said when she returned to her camp. "Something intelligent, something that doesn't want to be found." The team packed up 2 weeks later, their study complete, or abandoned Jake, never found out which, but they left behind equipment, cameras still functional, solar panels still charging batteries. Moses and Jake spent a day carefully removing every device, destroying the memory cards, ensuring no evidence remained. That night, Moses did something new. He vocalized in what seemed like language, not human language, but structured sounds with repetition and rhythm that suggested meaning. He was trying to actually talk to Jake, to communicate complex ideas that gestures couldn't convey. Jake responded as best he could, mimicking Moses' sounds, trying to find patterns. They spent hours in this crude conversation, and while Jake never fully understood what Moses was trying to say, the effort itself was profound. Moses was attempting to bridge the gap between species with language, creating a pidgin that might, given time, become true communication. November was harsh that year, early blizzards, temperatures that plummeted without warning. Jake was running low on supplies, but couldn't risk a town run with the weather so unpredictable. Moses noticed Jake's rationing, saw him eating less, conserving fuel. He started hunting for Jake, not just bringing scraps or foraged plants, but actual fresh meat. A rabbit one day, a turkey the next, always cleaned and prepared, ready to cook. But the most touching moment came during a whiteout that trapped Jake in his tent for 3 days. The wind was so fierce, it threatened to tear the shelter apart. Jake was genuinely scared, running out of water, nearly out of food, the cold seeping through every layer he had. On the second night, Jake heard digging outside. Moses was building a snow wall around his tent, creating a windbreak. He worked for hours in conditions that would have killed Jake in minutes. When the wall was complete, the difference was immediate. The wind still howled, but Jake's tent was stable, protected. Moses didn't leave. For 3 days, he stayed close, maintaining the wall, bringing Jake snow to melt for water, even sharing his own body heat during the coldest hours. They weathered that storm together, and when it finally broke, when the sun came out and the world was transformed into crystalline beauty, they emerged as something more than friends. They were family. December brought new challenges and revelations. A documentary crew had heard rumors about unusual wildlife in the Wind River Range. They arrived with high-tech equipment, thermal drones, and a determination to find evidence of cryptids. This wasn't like the scientists who stumbled close to the truth. These people were actively hunting for Moses. The stress was visible in Moses' behavior. He paced constantly, made agitated vocalizations, even struck trees in frustration. Every instinct must have screamed at him to flee, to find new territory far from human intrusion. But he stayed. He stayed because Jake was there, because leaving meant abandoning their connection. That loyalty humbled Jake. Here was a being who could vanish into the wilderness and never be found, choosing to remain in danger because of their friendship. They developed more sophisticated countermeasures. Jake monitored the documentary crew's radio chatter with a scanner head brought from town. Moses learned to recognize the sound of drones, could spot them against the sky long before they could detect him. They created false trails, fake evidence that led nowhere, a disinformation campaign that would have made intelligence agencies proud. The breakthrough came when Moses found their base camp while they were out filming. He didn't disturb anything, didn't leave obvious signs of intrusion, but he memorized their equipment, their routines, their weaknesses. That night, Moses drew patterns in the dirt, showing Jake their positions, their blind spots, where they'd be vulnerable to misdirection. Together, they orchestrated a series of false sightings that led the crew progressively farther from both Jake's still and Moses' actual territory. Jake would leave subtle signs, broken branches, disturbed ground that suggested movement in specific directions. Moses would create authentic-looking tracks that aged just right, appearing fresh enough to be exciting, but old enough to suggest the creature had moved on. The crew spent 2 weeks chasing ghosts, getting increasingly frustrated as each promising lead dead-ended in empty wilderness. They finally gave up on Christmas Eve, packing their equipment and heading back to civilization with nothing but blurry footage of elk and bears. That Christmas, Jake cooked a real feast, used up most of his remaining supplies to make cornbread stuffing, venison stew, even a crude approximation of apple pie using dried fruit and honey. Moses arrived just as Jake was plating everything, drawn by smells that must have traveled for miles. They ate together in companionable silence, Moses trying each dish with careful consideration, Jake enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with a friend. When they finished, Jake gave Moses his Christmas present, a military surplus blanket, thick wool that would last decades. Moses examined it with wonder, running his hands over the tight weave, testing its warmth. Then he left, returning an hour later with his gift for Jake. It was a geode cracked open to reveal purple crystals that sparkled in the firelight. Moses had carried it who knows how far, saved it for who knows how long, waiting for the right moment to share its beauty. January 2020 started with a federal raid that nearly ended everything. Someone had tipped them off, probably Hobbs making one last attempt at revenge. They came in force this time. ATF, Forest Service, even a DEA unit, helicopters, dogs, the works. Moses' warning gave Jake maybe 10 minutes. Not enough time to hide everything, barely enough time to destroy the most incriminating evidence. Jake was pouring high-proof alcohol over everything, preparing to burn it all. When Moses did something unprecedented, he revealed himself to humans, not directly, but strategically. He showed himself to the dog unit first, just a glimpse through the trees, enough to send the dogs into a panic. German shepherds trained to face armed criminals ran yelping back to their handlers, tails between their legs, refusing to track despite commands and encouragement. Then Moses started breaking trees, big ones. The crack of trunks snapping echoed through the valley like artillery. The agents could hear something massive moving through the forest, getting closer, circling their position. They tried to maintain protocol, but you could see the fear in their movements, hands moving to weapons, voices getting higher. The raid commander made the call to withdraw after one of his men claimed to see something bipedal and enormous moving between the trees. They retreated to their staging area, requested backup, started talking about possible bear attacks or unstable individuals in ghillie suits. By the time they returned with reinforcements, Moses and Jake had erased every trace of the still. They'd worked through the night, Moses carrying equipment Jake could never have moved alone. Jake directing the concealment with desperate efficiency. When the sun rose, Jake's camp looked like nothing more than a wilderness shelter for an eccentric hermit. They searched for 2 days, found nothing actionable, left with warnings about federal land use and vague threats about surveillance. But Jake could see it in their eyes. They'd felt something in those woods, something that made them want to be anywhere else. Moses had weaponized their primal fears without ever directly confronting them. February brought a different kind of challenge. Jake got sick, really sick, some kind of respiratory infection that left him weak and feverish. In civilization, it would have meant antibiotics and bed rest. Out here, it might mean death. Moses knew something was wrong before Jake did. He started hovering, checking on Jake multiple times a day instead of his usual sporadic visits. When the fever really hit, when Jake could barely crawl out of his tent, Moses took over completely. He brought Jake water constantly, somehow understanding that hydration was crucial. He maintained the fire without being asked, even figured out how to use Jake's camp stove when the wood ran low. Most remarkably, Moses foraged for medicinal plants, bringing Jake pine needle tea and willow bark that actually helped with the fever. For 3 days, Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, and every time he woke, Moses was there watching, waiting, ready with water or food or just his presence. Moses would make soft rumbling sounds, almost like a cat's purr but deeper, more resonant. The sound was oddly comforting, gave Jake something to focus on besides the misery. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Jake woke clear-headed, but weak as a kitten, to find Moses asleep sitting up, leaning against a boulder near his tent. He'd been keeping vigil for days, exhausting himself with constant care. When Moses woke and saw Jake sitting up, actually alert, the relief on his face was unmistakably human. He brought Jake's soup head somehow, made using Jake's pot, and ingredients he'd gathered. It was actually good, seasoned with wild herbs, rich with nutrients. They sat together while Jake ate, Moses watching every spoonful like a worried mother, Jake trying not to cry at the tenderness of this supposedly mythical beast, caring for him with more devotion than his own family had shown in years. The weeks that followed were peaceful, almost idyllic. Jake recovered his strength slowly, and Moses was there every step of the way, bringing food, maintaining the camp, just being present. They'd developed a routine so natural it felt like they'd been doing it for lifetimes instead of months. But all good things come to an end, and Jake's came in March. He received word through his network that his daughter, his youngest, the one who'd been just 12 when he left, was getting married. She wanted him there. After 8 years of silence, she wanted her father at her wedding. Jake sat by his fire that night, thinking about what that meant. Going back to civilization, to the life he'd left behind. Wearing a suit instead of flannel, making small talk instead of talking to Moses under the stars. The thought made him sick to his stomach, but she was his daughter, and she wanted him there. Moses arrived that evening and immediately sensed something was different. Jake tried to explain using gestures and words Moses couldn't understand, but seemed to feel anyway. He pointed at himself, then at the trail leading away, then made gestures for time and return. But even as he did it, Jake wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Would he return? Could he, after tasting civilization again? Or would the soft beds and hot showers and normal human interaction pull him back into that world permanently? Moses made a sound Jake had never heard before, something between a whimper and a groan, unmistakably sad. He understood, maybe not the details, but the core truth. Jake was leaving, and there was a chance he wouldn't come back. They sat together that night until dawn, not sleeping, just being together. Jake told Moses stories about his daughter, about watching her grow up, about teaching her to ride a bike, and helping her with homework, and all the normal dad things he'd done before everything fell apart. Moses listened with that intense focus, occasionally making soft sounds that felt like responses. When the sun came up, Jake started packing. Not everything he left, Most of his gear, the still dismantled but hidden, a message in itself. This wasn't goodbye forever. This was "I'll be back." Moses watched him pack, then disappeared into the forest. Jake thought that was it, that Moses had said his goodbye in his own way. But an hour later, Moses returned carrying something carefully in both hands. It was a carving. Moses had taken a piece of pine and carved it crude by human standards, but undeniably intentional. It showed two figures sitting by a fire, one large, one small, Jake and Moses. Jake took the carving with shaking hands. "I'll keep this safe," he said, his voice cracking. "And I'll come back. I promise." Moses placed one massive hand on Jake's shoulder, the gesture they'd shared so many times. Then he turned and walked into the forest. Jake watched until he disappeared, then shouldered his pack and started the long hike toward civilization. The wedding was beautiful. Jake's daughter cried when she saw him, ran to him despite her white dress and heels, hugged him so hard he could barely breathe. His ex-wife was there, civil if not warm. His son, older now and looking so much like Jake it hurt, shook his hand and actually smiled. They wanted him to stay. His daughter especially, talking about how they could spend time together now, make up for the lost years. Jake told them he needed to settle some things, tie up loose ends in Wyoming. "He'd be back," he said, "soon." But as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to a month, Jake found himself making excuses. The weather in the mountains was still too unpredictable. He needed to deal with some property issues. He had business to finish. His daughter understood, or pretended to, but he could see the disappointment in her eyes each time he delayed his return. The truth was simpler and more complicated. Jake was scared. Scared of what it meant, that he'd rather be in a tent in the Wyoming wilderness, talking to a cryptid, than living in comfort near his family. Scared of what that said about him as a person, as a father. Scared that if he went back to Moses, he'd never be able to leave again. 2 months passed. Jake got a job doing construction in Casper, rented a small apartment. He went to dinner with his daughter and her new husband every Sunday. He was rebuilding his life, doing the normal thing, the right thing. But every night, he'd hold that wooden carving and remember the warmth of the fire, the intelligence in Moses' eyes, the feeling of being understood without having to explain yourself, the simple truth of a friendship that transcended everything humans usually thought was important. One night in May, Jake's daughter asked him if he was happy. They were sitting on her porch, drinking beer, watching the sunset. "Of course," Jake said automatically. "Dad." She put her hand on his. "You look miserable, like you're doing time instead of living life." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Really. Is it because of us? Because of me and Mom and—" "No," Jake interrupted. "You guys are the best thing that's happened to me in years. I'm grateful every day that you let me back into your life." "Then what is it?" Jake looked at his daughter. This beautiful woman would grown up without him, would somehow found it in her heart to forgive him anyway. He thought about lying, making something up. But she deserved the truth, even if it was a truth she wouldn't understand. "There's someone I left behind in the mountains," Jake said carefully. "Someone who needed me, who depended on our friendship, and I abandoned him." His daughter's face went through several expressions: confusion, understanding, concern. "Is this someone you can go back to? Make things right?" "Maybe. I don't know if he'd forgive me." "Dad, look at me." She waited until he met her eyes. "I forgave you. If I can forgive you for missing 8 years of my life, your friend can forgive you for missing 2 months. But you have to go. You have to at least try. But you will be here when you get back. If you get back. Dad, I love you, but I don't want a dad who's here in body, but gone in spirit. Go do what you need to do. Make peace with whoever this is. Then decide where you belong. I'll support whatever you choose." Jake drove through the night, packed nothing but essentials and the wooden carving, took the rough roads at speeds that probably should have killed him, hiked the final 37 miles in 2 days instead of the usual 3. When he finally climbed that last ridge and saw his camp, his real home, he broke down crying. Everything was exactly as Head left it. The still pieces still hidden in the cave. His tent still standing despite 2 months of weather. Firewood stacked neatly beside the fire pit. Fresh firewood. Recent firewood. Moses, Jake called out, his voice cracking. Moses, I'm back. I'm sorry I left. I'm sorry I was gone so long. I don't know if you can forgive me, but I'm here now. I'm home. Nothing. Just the wind through the pines and the distant call of a raven. Jake built a fire and waited. Made dinner cornbread with honey, Moses' favorite, and left it at the edge of camp like they used to do. Talked to the empty forest about where had been, what had done, why had come back. I had to see them, Jake said to the darkness. Had to know if I could fit back into that world. And you know what I learned? I don't belong there anymore. Maybe I never did. This is home. You're my family. And I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. The sun set. The stars came out. The temperature dropped. Jake fed the fire and kept talking, pouring out everything Head held in for 2 months. Around midnight, he ran out of words. Just sat there, staring into the flames, accepting that Head lost the most important friendship of his life through his own cowardice. That's when he heard it. A wood knock, 3 deliberate strikes, the old signal, law enforcement. But there were no agents, no helicopters, just Moses' way of saying, I'm here. Jake stood up, his heart pounding. Moses, is that really you? A massive shadow detached from the trees. Moses stepped into the firelight, looking thinner than Jake remembered, the hair around his eyes damp like he'd been crying, if such a thing was possible. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Moses made a sound half growl, half sob, and closed the distance between them. He grabbed Jake in a hug that lifted him off the ground, holding him so tight Jake could barely breathe. I'm sorry, Jake gasped. I'm so sorry. I should never have left. Moses set him down but didn't let go, just held Jake's shoulders and made those rumbling sounds that meant he was trying to communicate. Jake pulled out the wooden carving from his pack and held it up. He kept it safe, just like I promised. And I came back, just like I promised. Moses took the carving, examined it, then set it carefully on a flat rock near the fire. Then he picked up the plate of cornbread and honey Jake had left out, looked at it, looked at Jake, and for the first time in their friendship, Moses smiled. Not a human smile exactly, but an expression of joy that transcended species. They sat by the fire that night, like old times, Jake talking, Moses listening. But something was different, something was deeper. They'd both made choices, Moses choosing to wait, to believe Jake would return. Jake choosing to come back, to accept where he truly belonged. As the fire burned down to coals and the stars wheeled overhead, Jake realized something. Head spent 8 years running from his failures, hiding in the wilderness, convincing himself he was better off alone. But Moses had taught him differently. Moses had shown him that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up, day after day, for someone who needs you. It's about choosing connection over isolation, trust over fear. Jake's daughter had been right. He had to make peace before he could move forward. And now, sitting beside his unlikely best friend under a Wyoming sky, Jake finally understood what peace felt like. So what's the lesson here, right? This whole story's fiction, completely made up, but the truth inside it is real as it gets. Sometimes, the most important relationships in your life are the ones that make no damn sense. Sometimes family is a 9-foot cryptid who learned to cook soup and leave you firewood. Sometimes home isn't where you came from, but where you finally stop running. Jake stayed in those mountains, made peace with his kids, visited them a few times a year, but always came back to the Wind River Range. Back to Moses, back to the life that actually fit him. They're probably still out there, an aging moonshiner and his impossible best friend, sitting by a fire, existing in the space between two worlds. Would you open that door? Would you choose helping over hiding? Would you go back for someone who needed you, even knowing it meant giving up everything normal and safe? Drop your thoughts below. This is completely fictional, every word of it. But ask yourself, what's more unbelievable that Bigfoot exists? Or that a human would choose loyalty over comfort, connection over civilization, truth over the easier lie? Peace.